Wake up with the sunrise, meditate to clear my mind. Thank you for this breath. I'm ready to be
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this healing session. I am your fearless hostess, Rachel W. Robinson, victim rights attorney, also a poet, published author, lyricist, gardener, as you all know, and just all the other things I was able to tap into on my own healing journey. And of course, I'm bringing all of that to you through these healing sessions because regardless what happens in court, if your spirit, soul, mind, and even your finances are not healed, there can really be no true justice. Today, I have Terry Garza. She was born and raised in Southwest Detroit, or Detroit if you're cool. She is a mother of three, two of whom were gifted through her blended family, and she is a grandmother to 8. She's a writer, storyteller, homicide survivor, advocate, and lover of a good dad joke. Terry, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. I'm really happy to be here.
So the first thing I want to jump in, how do you define homicide survivor?
A homicide survivor is family, friends, and other loved ones that are left behind to deal with the aftermath when someone dies by homicide.
And can you describe what happened to you? How did you become a homicide survivor?
All stories are different, but the tragedy is always the same. My daughter's father was both the perpetrator, and there were victims who are in our family that were victims of his. It was domestic in nature. We had met when I was 14, and it didn't work. And we had a child together. And so when I was 20, I had moved out on my own, and he lived just a mile from where I was at with his mom. But he had a deep episode, a mental health episode, and he stabbed his mother to death. And this was in 1982. So this was at 2:30 in the morning. His mother grabbed her keys and her shoes, and she ran out of the house to escape him. And he chased her a few doors down on the neighbor's lawn, and he stabbed her to death with a pair of scissors. And when his oldest brother came out to help her, to rescue her, he took him down too. And his brother, who initially survived that attack, ended up committing suicide a few years later. So at the end of the day, this is what people don't understand. Homicide doesn't just end with the victim. We lost 2 people in our family to suicide because they couldn't deal with the trauma.
Who else committed suicide?
It was his brother who he attacked that night. He initially survived the attack, and about 5 years later, he committed suicide. And the victim's brother, his mother, her brother, ended up committing suicide a few years later as well. So,
Wow.
yeah. And it's not uncommon. Homicide and suicide we're both sides of the same coin. We are. Our trauma is the same in the fact that we couldn't control it, and we don't know what caused it, and we're not going to get the answer to the why.
Was your ex, was he diagnosed with anything formally, or you just know that he had that temperament that came out that night?
Well, I knew of what his mental health was like. There had been times prior to this, leading up to this, where, he had attempted to self-harm before. This was when we were younger, and I was ending the relationship initially. And he attempted to self-harm there. So I knew he had a tendency for things like that. But when he was finally apprehended, they said he was completely disconnected for 3 days. He didn't know what had happened to him. And they said he had a certain level of like a narcotic psychosis because he was under the influence.
Drug-induced psychotic break, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Basically, that's what it was, a drug-induced psychotic break.
Wow. Can you tell us about the journey that you've gone through, particularly having a child with this person, and how you have healed yourself, transmuted that pain, and then after that, how you guided your daughter through that?
We get what's called a death notification. Some people get a formal notification from either the medical examiner's office or 2 police officers showing up on your door, tap, tap, tap. Mine was through my mother. She was reading an article in the newspaper. Now, when I initially heard all of this, I thought my world was over. Okay. And I had a reaction. I mean, I was broken. I had a reaction that was so surreal. And the details of it were so emotional. I ended up dropping to the floor and I couldn't breathe. And then I had this caterwauling when I finally could catch my breath come out of me. Now, my baby girl, we had just come home from running around for the day. And I finally found my breath and I could look up at her and I could see her. And she looked at me and I looked at her, and she, like that, instantly met me there in my trauma. And immediately I stuffed it down. I said, I told myself, she will never hear anything from me about this moment in time ever again. My whole focus was on her in that moment. She was a year and a half old. She would have never comprehended what I was saying. All I did was want to comfort her and calm her down and bring her into a state of everything's okay again.
Because she was sensing your panic. She was responding to your panic.
She fed into it like that. I mean, your kids, and this is the thing too, your kids are very in tuned to what is going on around you. Very much so. As I look back on this now, and I look on this with the long arm of 42 years, okay, there's things that I see I could have done. I struggle with suicidal ideation, and I had come to a moment where I was like, I had already had a plan. And, the universe works in strange ways, and I didn't. And my baby daughter really was the anchor that kept me here. That didn't mean when I decided that I wasn't going to harm myself that I didn't struggle with that. I did struggle with it for decades. But I always knew at the end of the day that I was going to be all right and that I was going to be okay. And one of the first things that I had to do was I needed resources. And I knew very early that if I didn't understand and get a handle on the suicidal ideation, I was going to be lost. So back then there weren't any resources. This is 1982. A homicide survivor, at that time, we weren't considered victim to a crime, because where the dead don't speak. And that was a big deal. So therefore, there weren't resources, and the resources are very limited now. Now, given where I lived, there was a small little clinic called Southwest Mental Health in Southwest Detroit. And it was a clinic that worked in conjunction with Wayne State University with students who had to do their clinical rotations to complete their degrees in social services and therapy. And so I called up there and I reached out to her, and it took me about a year before I made that phone call. And when I did, I got there, and I was like 20, 21, and there was this lovely young lady sitting across from me, just a few years older than I am. And I open up and I tell her, and I'm crying, and I'm like, just tell me how to make it stop. And so I gather myself and I take a moment to look at her, and she was in over her head. What do I say to you is basically what the look on her face was. And that was pretty much it. And there weren't any resources, but I just stayed true to myself and on the course of being, everything was going to be okay. Everything was going to be all right. When I really went on this healing journey, I looked back and I see at the times where, like my mother, when I was a little girl, she gifted me with this saying that she used to tell me all the time, that God put me here for a reason. And I believe that that was my gift from God, from the universe, and from my mother, knowing that I would need that down the line. And I always held on to that. And I always knew that everything was going to be all right and everything was going to be okay. And as dark as my times got and as strong as my suicidal ideation was, that was my anchor. I went back to, God put me here for a reason. Everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay. And that got me to surviving when things got hard. So you have to find something that gives you purpose. And to me, I always knew that I was going to find purpose in this, and you have to find it.
And you absolutely have. Yes, you absolutely have. Can you describe, for the suicidal ideation, what is the thought behind it? Is it that you can't take this pain anymore and you want it to end? Or is it, I'm to blame somehow? Or is it, I could have, would have, should have? What is behind that?
That's a good question. Behind it is a couple of things. The pain, okay, and the source of the pain, as I've healed, comes down to two things. At least for me, it might be different for everybody else, but for me, it was the guilt for having survived. Okay, And then it was the shame associated with having experienced homicide. Those two things, when they're married together, the pain is unbelievable. And the shame, you wouldn't think of shame as being painful, but it is. It's very painful. And that was the biggest thing behind my suicidal ideation, was the pain and the shame and the guilt for surviving. And I do believe most of us who do survive have that, what's called survivor's guilt. It's a true thing, both in homicide and suicide.
And when we're talking about your healing journey, obviously you went to the mental health clinic. They were out of their depth with being able to help you.
Mhm.
What did you go to next? What are some of the steps that you were able to take and other resources that you created or found that you found helpful?
Well, this is going to sound strange, but I actually started a quest. My journey was to prove that God didn't exist, because I truly believed, as much as I know this sounds like a clash with God put me here for a reason, and then God didn't exist. That's the war. That's the conflict. I was at war with that. Mm-mm, mm-mm, mm-mm. And I was like, and I am going to be better than God. I'm going to outsmart this grief, and I am going to build a world, a life for my daughter, so that she will never see or feel the darkness that I felt. And so I think, because I made that my mission, I had to find resources for her. And I was like, yeah, I'm better than God. My ego was like, I was so angry. Yeah, okay, God put me here for a reason, but does he really exist? And oddly enough, that was my fuel. That was it. I'm like, I'm going to prove, and I'm going to get my daughter through this, and she's not going to feel what I felt. And that's going to be my proof that God doesn't exist. That's really what I thought.
That's
And
fascinating. Yeah.
I know.
Also, as an example of how righteous rage or just rage in general and anger can be such a motivator when we're channeling it in a way that pushes us through these hard times. People look at it, anger as like it's automatically negative, avoid it. Sometimes it's the fuel you need.
Yeah, it is. Sometimes it is. I love the term righteous rage. I never thought of that time in my life as that. And it was rageful. Now, my three feelings were, I had anger, hatred, and rage. And a lot of us do, that go through this. And we have it on such a level that people will never begin to understand. So I started using this analogy, and firstborn parents will always get this. Will get this. When you become a parent, specifically for the first time, and you hold your baby for that first time, you never knew love like that before. I mean, it's big and it's bold and it's overwhelming. And you're like, wow, it's this new discovery of who you are and how much you can love. Imagine that feeling filled with anger, hatred, and rage, how big that is. And so, yeah, so I carried that with me. But there aren't people there to tell you, though, when you first experience your homicide, those feelings are there to protect you. And they are, and they're doing what they're doing. And that poor social worker, coming out of school, didn't have the ability to tell me that, because I don't think it was really taught back then. The goal is to get them to talk about their feelings, and hopefully they make peace with it. And it's just not that simple.
Mm-mm. And so, in your quest to find the resources for your daughter, what did you come upon next?
Well, what I did was, we lived in Dearborn. We lived in Detroit for her first few years of school. And at that point, when she was in second grade, I started getting notification from the courts that her father was up for parole. Now, this is going to blow people's mind. Everything that I described in his crimes, his total sentence was 7.5 years. He was paroled. Okay. So I was getting rumblings of this, and I'm like, okay, I always answered her questions when she asked me about her dad in a way that she could understand, because I didn't want her to be a family secret. And if she was going to learn the truth, she was going to hear it from me first. And then when I got notification that he was coming out, that he was going to be paroled in a certain amount of time, I thought, okay, great. I knew once he got paroled, the first thing he was going to do was come for us. And I don't mean that in an aggressive way. He'd want to see me. He'd want to see his daughter. I knew him. So I went and I saw the parole board, and I said, well, what options do I have as her mother legally? And they said, well, you have to talk to a lawyer. We're not family law. And I was working at a law firm at the time, and I went to the family lawyer who specialized in family law. And I told him my situation, and he said, you don't have any rights to keep him from her. that's how the law states. So I was like, okay. So now I knew what I was dealing with. So I went to the school that we were going to. We had moved to Dearborn, and she had just started school. That's her third grade year. And I went to the principal and I said, listen, this is my name. This is my daughter. She wasn't there with me. I said, and this is what we're dealing with at home. And I said, and I don't know what to do. I said, I do know that her father's going to be getting paroled, in X amount of time. I am telling her the truth, but I need to work with the teacher. I want to know that as she's learning this truth about herself and her father and our story, how that's going to manifest in the classroom. Because I truly believe that the teacher was going to see it first, and that made sense to me. And so he says, let me call you back. And a few hours later, he calls me back and he set up a meeting with the teacher, him, myself, and the school social worker. And so we had formed an alliance at that time. And every year, and the school social worker, my daughter went and talked to the school social worker a couple of times a month, a wonderful woman. And that's pretty much how it went. That was the only resources that I could create. Now, leaning on the church that I was at war with, I felt, putting myself aside, how I felt about God, I thought she would need a foundation that she could lay on. And so I went back to the church. I became involved in the church with her. She became an altar server. I got our family priest involved. And I also sought outside sessions with a social worker as well. So I built this big alliance. So if she couldn't talk to me, that I thought she would have someone in her network that she could talk to. And that's what I did. And that was the best thing I could have ever done.
Absolutely. And did you find that you were healing vicariously through providing this for her? Or did you also need to go on your own separate journey as well?
You know what? It's funny you should say that because I never once addressed my feelings ever about the homicide. I was like, my entire focus was on her. I wanted to get her truly. I wanted to create a bubble around her where she would never feel those dark feelings. When I started to address myself and my feelings, her father, he was paroled. He came home. We went through that. She met him. He met her. And it was a very emotional moment for her. And now, mind you, this was someone I loved. He loved me. And she's having this relationship with him because this is who she comes from, the other part of her. And I have all this rage against this man. I hated him. I was angry with him. I was rageful with him. And I had to still sit on that. And I never addressed that for decades. I would go in and pretend I was going to address it in private therapy sessions. And the only time I got involved in private therapy sessions for myself when I said I need to deal with this, it's because he violated parole. He went back to prison for 5 years after he made this connection with his daughter. And I said, if I connect you to her, you have to stay here with her because I'm not going to go through this again with her. And he violated and he went back to prison for 5 years. And when she was dealing with that abandonment again, a second time from him, she attempted to self-harm.
Oh my God.
And I felt like a failure. I did. I felt like I failed her. And I didn't know what to do. So the bubble and the network that I created, not that, not, and I look back on it now and we have a dear friend in common, Jan. And I was sharing this with her on a TikTok live, and she said to me, and I never looked at it in that way before, just imagine what would have happened if she didn't have that network.
That's right.
So at that point, all I could do was stand back, and I realized now that she was on her own journey, and all I could do was watch her from afar. And, and this was God's plan for her. And I did. I watched her from afar, and then I decided, you know what? I need to start looking inward and seeing where I failed her this is still where I'm going. Seeing where I failed her, I have to look inward. But basically now when I look on this and healing, people need to understand, healing is a recovery like any other. Substance abuse, alcohol abuse, a gambling addiction, whatever it might be. And it doesn't always take the first time, and it might not take the second time. And it might take 10 or 20 times taking a stab at dealing with these feelings that make you feel bad. But it's going to take a while before it sticks. And the fact that you keep going back to it is the key, because you want this. You don't want to feel bad. And those feelings, those bad feelings, they're not bad, they're good. And it's hard to understand because we live in a country that praises what we look like on the outside. You look good. It doesn't matter what you think or how you feel on the inside. And though while the tide is now changing and we are now addressing mental health issues, and there's a difference between mental health struggles from PTSD and mental health issues from things like, schizophrenia, bipolar disease. Those are two separate terms, two separate categories in the mental health field. And you just have to keep coming back and knowing that if this is truly what you want, yeah, it's going to hurt. It is going to hurt to look at yourself and those feelings. And they're bad. They're really, really bad. And that's okay.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on something really important. We do live in a culture where we are expected to perform happiness all the time.
All the time.
One of the few cultures, coming to the US where you have to smile at everyone all the time. You're supposed to say hello. And it's just not everywhere requires that. And so I wonder how much of that is an obstacle to true, authentic healing when you have to pretend to be so happy and strong all the time.
I can tell you from my own personal experience, it was for me, it was a huge obstacle, because every time I refer to my anger, my hatred and rage, now that I'm healed, okay, as my junkyard dogs. They were there to protect me. They were there to protect my daughter, our little family, and they did their job and they did it well. The problem was, before I became healed, was they were here all the time. I mean, I walked into the world and I was like, yeah, bring it, But at the same time, I wanted to have that happiness, that happy front, like, oh, look she's got it together. She's got this great job and she's got this house and she's got this car and her kid and all this other stuff, everything that people look at to judge people by. And when I would get to that level of like, oh my God, I feel really good. And then I had a trigger that would bring up my junkyard dogs, I would go dark. And that's where my suicide ideation would kick in. It's like, why am I doing this? Because you're not happy and you're feeling these awful feelings. Why do these awful feelings keep coming up? Well, that's because I haven't dealt with them, and they're not awful. They're good feelings. And at the end of the day, of course, I see that now, but I didn't see that then.
Survivors of homicide have not been recognized as victims in the mainstream. And I will add, under the Victim Rights Act, the closest survivor legally is considered the victim. But it was right around when this crime happened, when this incident happened, is when the victim rights laws were just coming out. And so there was no legal definition at that time for how to support you and the family and how to view you for purposes of the case. Not well defined. And so the resources that are now available to victims, which still only amounts to a list of therapists, and yes, the DA's office will pay for them. Not always the most robust way to support. But now that we have that, and we could incorporate homicide survivors into it more robustly, what's needed? What can we do?
Well, there's first of all, okay, when you get a diagnosis of PTSD or CPTSD, it almost sounds like a life sentence. When I first found out that I had something that explained all the craziness that was going on inside of me, it made me feel good, but then it was almost like a life sentence. Well, what do I do with this? And so I see, okay, this is my vision and this is what I'm working with. And I'm trying to connect with the proper people that can help that can see what I see. Is it has to be funded, because you can go out there and you can join all kinds of support groups, but support groups are really good, don't get me wrong, but not everybody can do a support group. And you can't get one-on-one therapy for as long as you're going to need it. And I know you mentioned like the DA's office will pay for it. I don't know if they do that here in Michigan, but nonetheless, it's going to take a long time to do that. So now for me, this is what I think needs to happen. And Jan and I had both spoken about this. It needs to be funded because it's not a one-off. You're not going to go and see a therapist for 6 months or a year and get better. So it needs to be funded. So where does that funding come from? Do we expect the federal government to fund us? Do we expect the state to fund us somehow? And so I'm going to pause on that for a minute, and then I'm going to bring up what we have as a result of all of these homicides that take place in this country and our nation's fascination with them. Because we have a genre in the entertainment industry that makes billions and billions of dollars off of our stories, and we don't get paid for that. Dateline 2020, 48 Hours, and then all the spin-off shows, A&E and Criminal Justice, all those shows, okay? And why not have them put money, if there's a homicide that's taking place, let's say in the state of Michigan, and they want to come to Michigan and they want to tell this story, then you have to put $1 million in a kitty. And because we don't get paid for those stories. I was on a crime show, but not for my homicide. We don't get paid for those. When you see people on Dateline, they don't get paid for that. They're sharing their story because they want to be seen and they want to be heard. And they're hoping something comes out of that.
So often there's not even consent of the victims, and they don't even interview them. They just use their image and their likeness and their story, and they make their money and they run. And it's absolutely an issue.
Yes. So because I'm always thinking about how would this be funded? How would this be funded? Because in all honesty, I worked for a government agency. And when I started my healing journey 5 years ago, I had the Cadillac of insurance plans. And the first thing I did was I called and I said, what is my coverage for mental health? And they said, it's unlimited. Now, thank you, God. Thank you, universe, for this beautiful gift. But not everybody has access to that. And it has taken me 4 years. There are all different kinds of things that come up. And I never really truly discovered the guilt and the shame for surviving and having experienced. I didn't realize that was truly behind all that darkness that I felt. So I think that's one way that can be funded. Yes, we should. If the perpetrator of a crime is not allowed to profit off of those, like Charles Manson would have never been able to write a book and make money off of it. Why is Dateline and 2020 and all these other shows allowed to profit off of it?
Right. And not give anything back
not give anything back. I think it's very reasonable. It's not going to hurt them any to, let's say, okay, you want to tell that story? That's going to cost NBC $1 million or $500,000. And we're going to put it in a crime kiddie pool here for the state of Michigan. And we're going to put it in a high yield interest bearing account so that is the gift that keeps on giving. And every story that's ever told in this state, no matter how many times it's told by Dateline and 2020 and 48 Hours, because they all take their own stab at it, you have to put money in that kitty. And then that kitty gets divvied up, and it's a resource that can fund programs like one-on-one therapy, maybe a therapy-led support group, and with people who have experience in trauma-informed therapy. Because not all trauma is the same. So we need people that are trauma-informed specific to homicide, trauma-informed specific to sexual assault, trauma-informed specific to domestic violence.
Indeed.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yes. I support that 100%.
Mm-hmm.
This is a brilliant idea. I mean, people film, and there's always tax and financial incentives and requirements when people film in any state. And so there's absolutely power there for the government, the local governments to impose something like that. And it should be done. Something I wanted to add, because you touched on, the Victims' Rights Fund is what I was mentioning when I said that, at least in Colorado, therapies are paid. Every state does have a Victim Rights Fund. I believe there's also one at the federal level. However, it is still limited. I mean, you made that brilliant point. It can't just be, I think, 32 sessions or 6 months or a year. It needs to be way more robust. It needs to be lifelong. The other piece that I want to add when you're talking about funding, maybe it comes also in addition to the fundings through these media opportunities that they're taking and the current victims funds that exist, whatever pot is paying for defendants to get access to alternative sentencing regimes that include rehabilitation, why don't we also contribute some of that and expand that to cover survivors' rehabilitation resources and recovery resources? If we can come up with so much money to incarcerate and then even rehabilitate the people who caused this, we're still leaving a huge gap in society when we have hurt people, traumatized people walking around still living in the aftermath. And so it would be just as important, I would think, yes, prevent recidivism by rehabbing the people committing the crimes, but also provide the healing for the people who suffered the crimes. That pot of money can I would want to know how we can tap into that as well. So I think we got two great ideas here.
Absolutely. Because I do see this being funded and it needs to be funded. I had made several attempts throughout the 90s after, I found out my daughter attempted to self-harm. I thought I have to do something for myself. I have to do something for myself. And, I worked for my health insurance. And, in the 90s, I was like, okay, well, let me see what my mental health coverage is on this. And sometimes there wasn't any, with the one job that I had. And then with the new job that I got, I called and it's like, well, you get 10 sessions a year. That is tragic. And even now, still, as we're coming up to speed and recognizing mental health as a true part of our overall being of health, physical and mental, a lot of insurance companies still don't cover that.
Right. No, they do not cover behavioral health. It's a different thing. And that can be, as you compared it to substance use in the past or, addictions, this is a part of our behavioral health. This is a part of our mental health. And those intensive interventions already are not covered even on as much as they should on substance uses. And now we have this whole other area of vulnerable people who need to be covered as well. I keep wanting to ask you, and I know people are be wondering, how did the conversation go with your daughter? How did you tell her about this?
Oh,
And how
okay.
old was she? How old was she?
She was 9 when I had to have the sit down with her. And given everything that had taken place, the only person I focused on was her father and her grandmother. Okay. I didn't tell her everything else. It was too much. I felt that was the meat of the matter, because everybody has a grandma. And so I took her to church. Again, that righteous rage, right? I took her to church and I said, Mommy wants to talk to you. And so I brought up her dad and I said, do you remember when Mommy told you this about your dad? And I bullet pointed every period in this journey up to this point in our journey, everything that we had discussed about her father. And I wanted her to acknowledge, yes, I remember. Yes, I remember. Yes, I remember. Okay, because I wanted to make sure we were on the same page. And then I said to her, I said, you know how Mommy has Grandma Garza? And she's like, yes. I said, well, your dad has a grandma too. And she's like, okay. And I said, but you're never going to get to meet that grandma. And she's like, okay. And I said, remember when I told you that your dad hurt people that we love? And she's like, yes. And I said, well, your dad hurt your grandma, your grandma on your dad's side. And that's why, you're not going to meet her. And so I could see her processing it. Like, I didn't use the word dead because I wanted her to identify what I was saying. And it's so silly that I look on that now. I mean, everything that I did was intuitive to me. I knew that this was my mission, and she looked at me and she said, like dead. And she put her head down like this. And I said, yes, like dead. And I expected her to be emotional about it, but she didn't get emotional. And so we wait for a moment. And I said, well, now your dad's home. Remember, I told you a judge made him go to this building had a lot of rooms. And now, the judge will tell him when he can come home. And now the judge has given him permission to come home. And your dad wants to meet you. And I said, and whatever you do, I told her, your feelings aren't right. Your feelings aren't wrong. They just are. If you want to meet him, that's okay. If you don't want to meet him, that's okay too. And whatever you choose, mommy will honor.
Mm.
And so she wanted to meet him. So, which I knew she would.
Wow. Wow.
It wasn't until she was a teenager that I told her all the rest of it, because it was a lot to handle.
Of course. Wow. Well, she is absolutely blessed to have you as a mother. I mean, you completely shielded her from your trauma. I mean, it sounds like she likely picked up on it, especially when he came back in the picture and, you know, the rage and all that. At least she had more context of it then, but the times that you had with her to build that team around her, it's just like Jan said, you have that time to build that resiliency in her, that safety with her. And so she wasn't learning that alone.
Yeah.
Ah,
But
I'm
but here's where hindsight comes in, okay? And and my daughter and I, we've had conversations about my healing now. And when I explained to her what it took for me to tap down my anger, my hatred, my rage that I felt at her father, because this was a boy that I loved. He was my first love. He was my first experience at this. And that was in direct conflict with all the anger and the rage that I felt for him. And when she started looking at it that way, she was like, come, like I never once would have ever thought about how that impacted you, because, I was very gracious with his time with her and building that bridge between the two of them. But I told her the best thing I could have ever done, now that I look back on this journey, and this is my sole purpose, to get people who are fresh into this journey, work on healing yourself first, because that is the best thing you can do for your child or your children and those around you, is heal yourself first. And if I could go back in time and change that, well, actually, no, I wouldn't, because I wouldn't be who I am now. And I truly wanted to go through this experience of living my life with no regrets. And I can say that from my experience, from my point of view. However, her dad can't say that, because he has regrets for what he did, and his brothers have regrets for what he did. And everybody who was touched by the experience has a regret. And I don't want to have a regret, because to have a regret means I won't be able to make peace with myself.
No, absolutely. And having that experience and thriving and surviving through it makes the advice even more powerful to tell others to take care of themselves first. Particularly though, when you have a 1.5-year-old child, it might be more possible to take care of yourself at the same time. I don't think you can completely leave the infant to
Yes.
figure it out,
No,
but at least at
no.
the same time. But I do sense that you vicariously like you were able to channel that rage into something that that's just where it needed to go at that time. There was nowhere
Exactly.
else, there was nowhere else to put it. We didn't have even the language for it, as you mentioned. You even only are just now able to even name it and understand it. And so now maybe people would be able to, in parallel, heal, because we have such more broad language and resources. Not enough, but yeah, you did what was available then. You mentioned the guilt of your ex, the guilt of his family, the shame that they're having and experiencing. I am very curious to know, in your conversations with him, if it's come up or just your observations of his demeanor, what is he feeling about this? And has he changed? Is this someone that the community would be worried about? Or is this, the kind of one-off psychotic break? And now he's even suffering with the consequences of that.
Well, the community is not at risk. The community at large is not at risk. And people often asked me, were you afraid? And I get confused with that, of being afraid of walking into the world with this. And I'm like, no. And they're like, no, were you afraid of him? And the answer again is no. I was not afraid of him. I knew how he felt about us. And that's where, specifically when homicide takes place within families, you struggle with those feelings of conflict, of loving and hating the person who's done this. But no, was I afraid of him? No. Was my daughter afraid of him? No. Did I ever feel like he was harmful or a threat to us? Never, ever, not once throughout this whole entire experience. But that being said, He is a danger to himself. He punishes himself. Now, when he got paroled the second time, and he came back again into our lives, and I knew it's like a moth to a flame. This is his family, And he got a great job working for one of the big three automotive companies here in Michigan. And he took me to court. He wanted to have established visitations. He started paying child support. And I thought, great, he's healing. He's being a father to his daughter, and my daughter's loving this. And I was grateful because he paid for her braces. But, as he was going through this, then all of a sudden I could see the decline. He was going strong for about 6 years with his job, and everything was consistent. And apparently, of course, he struggles with his own demons about this. He has his own darkness. And he started to experience that darkness. And he had remarried and had another child. And he went so dark that she became his ex-wife. They were separated. She called me. She's like, I'm concerned. I don't know what to do with him. I got a call from my daughter. I'm concerned about Dad. I don't know what to do with him. And I told them both, I said, you need to step away and just let him be. He's got to figure this out on his own. You can't save him. He is punishing himself, and he needs to make peace with him, peace with God, whatever that looks like. And oddly enough, he reached out to me during this period, and I accepted his call. In fact, he came to my home, and people were like, are you crazy? But, we talked, and I told him, I said, you need to do something spectacular with your life. You have an experience that no one else will ever have. And if there's anybody who knows the frailty of life, it's you. You got to find a way to give back, because this isn't who you are. And he started crying. And he struggles. He goes back and forth. He struggles with his addiction. He punishes himself. He has 3 daughters, and, they all now understand that this is just his self-abuse. His self-abuse and his self-harm is his punishment. But he was recently on the news as I was. I moved into helping. I lent my story to pushing a domestic violence bill through Michigan. He works with this homeless agency. And so he's trying to give back in some way. And I'm grateful that he's doing this. And I want to see him make peace with himself. And because I think once he does, then maybe my daughter might see that and feel that too. I don't know. That's my hope.
You are a miracle. That is miraculous and so beautiful. So you mentioned how PTSD, people get these diagnoses and they might think it's a life sentence. Talk to me about what comes after then. How do people heal from that, and what would you call that?
Well, you go from surviving to thriving, okay? And when I first got my diagnosis of PTSD, it does feel like a life sentence. It makes sense, why you're feeling all of these, overwhelming feelings, but is that all? And the several different attempts that I made going through therapy over the years, it was always the same with talk therapy. It was talk about your feelings. Well, why do you think you felt that way? And it's the same thing over and over again. And there is something that's called post-traumatic growth. When I went on this last healing journey, the one that really stuck, I said, there are 2 things I want to accomplish. I want to, when I go back on this healing journey, I want to know that I don't have to stay in this spot, number one. And I want to look side by side and see all the places where there was good, where there was happiness, because I have this big trauma over here, but you have all these little pockets of joy and happiness that get lost in the shuffle. And so I wanted to marry that and bring it to me. And one of the things that I discovered was the best part of my life was, before the homicide, was I'm a mom. I'm a new mom. And there's a sense of softness that comes with being a new mom. And I was a teacher. I had a little classroom set up with my daughter, and I was so excited. And we had a routine every morning, the alphabets and all the little stuff that I had set up for her. And then at night before she went to bed. And I found that pocket there, and I was like, that was like the biggest part of my life, where I was soft, I was vulnerable, but I was strong, and I was confident, and I was fearless. And I lost that. And when I went back on that healing journey, I said, why can't I bring this back with me? I want this. And so that's when I started learning about post-traumatic growth. Like, you can take parts of your trauma that you had in the past and you can bring them with you and thrive on those still. Or you can also develop new things that bring you joy and bring you happiness. And it's called post-traumatic growth. So you can thrive on that too. So it's important that, yeah, you got the PTSD over here, and that's not a good diagnosis, but it's an understanding of how you feel. But you can work through it and you can get to post traumatic growth, which is the thriving on the other side that you survive with on PTSD.
That is exactly what I would call me tapping back into all these pre-traumatic talents that I had as a youth, and really just self-actualizing in a way that I don't think, if I had not experienced the traumas that I did, that forced me inward, forced me to redefine my identity, pick up pieces of who I was before that, and use them to strengthen and fulfill myself. Then yeah, that's exactly how I would describe the different multifaceted person that I think I've become. And I just love the way you're putting that. I mean, it is a lot of growth that comes out of that. And if we're not ever uncomfortable, and this is beyond uncomfortability, that's an understatement for trauma, but just think about, even in the smallest way, if we're not uncomfortable, we don't move. If we don't feel a fire, we don't move our hand. If we don't, and so that is absolutely an evolved and compassionate way to look at our suffering that I really appreciate. Thank you for that term,
You're welcome.
post-traumatic growth.
Well, it's not my term, but actually I found out that it's been in the process. It's become a part of the psychological and psychiatric community as far back as in the 90s, but I never heard of it until now. And so I wonder, why is this a secret?
We don't have access to the resources. We need more mental health resources out there. We need healthcare to be more robust in general. We need victims funds to be more robust and catering to this need. It'll get there. We're going to get it there.
It will. We sure will. We're going to be legendary.
Okay, so this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Terry. I've learned so much and grown so much. And I look forward to being able to continue to collaborate with you, particularly on those policy ideas when it comes to funding these resources for survivors, inherently important in our society so that it can be healed. Where can we find you to continue hearing from you and supporting you?
Well, I have a podcast that has been neglected, but I'm getting back into that now, starting now actually. It's called There Is Life After, and you can reach me if you have a question or concern, or you want somebody to talk to, you want to share your story. You can send me an email at thereislifeafter@gmail.com.
And what's your TikTok handle? Because we love the dad jokes.
I know, we do love the dad jokes, don't we? You can see me on TikTok at Terry, that's TERRY _Garza _Detroit Girl, all one word. And you can watch my healing journey. You can go back and watch my old TikToks and you can see, I'm really proud of myself. So yeah, I've come a long way. And actually I have a lot of that to thank on TikTok because it is a safe spot. You might not think it, but it really is.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sherry. It has been a pleasure having you on. As you all know, I am Rachel, your friendly neighborhood victim rights attorney, and I hope you've enjoyed this very special healing session. Continue healing.
Journey through the valley of the shadow while I stand tall in the light with me. There is no sense to battle because I come in peace. I came to set myself free. And if you open your eyes, you will see my divinity.